Have you ever stopped to think that the history of Japan, a country so distant and mysterious, might be connected to the ancient scriptures of the Bible? What if I told you that the ancestors of the Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans could trace their roots back to the same biblical figures that shaped the rest of the world? It sounds unlikely, right? But the answers might be hidden within the pages of a book that few imagine is related to the East. Let's explore these hidden connections together and uncover how the Bible might be more present in Japan's history than you ever imagined. According to the Bible, all of humanity descends from Adam and Eve, the first humans created by God. After the Great Flood, Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the ancestors of all the nations of the world. Each of them gave rise to a lineage that, over the centuries, formed different ethnic groups that spread across the 4 corners of the earth. Now imagine how these lineages branched out, traveling through deserts, crossing mountains and seas, until they reached regions as distant as Asia, home to ancient civilizations like the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. The scriptures suggest that just like the peoples of the Middle East and Europe, Asians are also connected to these biblical roots. And it's here that we start to uncover mysteries that go beyond the obvious. Think of Japan, an island nation with such a rich and ancient culture. It's hard to imagine that its history could be related to the ancient Hebrew scriptures. But what if the Bible offers clues about the origins of all peoples, including Asians? And what if, behind the Shinto temples and ancestral traditions, there are echoes of biblical lineages? The Bible speaks of the Table of Nations, which describes the branching of the lineages of Noah's sons. Japheth, for example, is mentioned as the progenitor of the peoples who spread to the north and west, including Europeans and, perhaps, Asians. Ancient scholars suggest that some of these peoples migrated eastward, eventually giving rise to civilizations like the Japanese. Why does this matter? Because these connections show that no matter how distant cultures may seem, the Bible offers us a unifying narrative, a story where all of us, in some way, are connected. And it's fascinating to think that even the peoples of the Far East might have their roots intertwined with ancient biblical stories. Whether these connections are literal, symbolic, or cultural, it's a mystery that many continue to explore. But one thing is certain: the biblical origins of ancient civilizations are a treasure trove of stories waiting to be rediscovered. And when we look at Japan, we begin to see even deeper traces of this possible biblical influence. Think about how Japanese culture, so rich and complex, seems to carry echoes of something much older. Could there be a connection between biblical figures and the Japanese people that extends beyond traditional narratives? Some scholars believe so. They suggest that the ancient biblical lineages mentioned in the Table of Nations not only influenced the Middle East and Europe, but also reached distant Japan. The Bible speaks of 3 main lineages descending from Noah's sons: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it's in Japheth that we find intriguing clues about the connection to the peoples of the East. In Japan, we find a culture that values discipline, honor, and tradition. But what if these values are reflections of ancient biblical influences, passed down from generation to generation? Some theologians and historians speculate that Japan, like other Asian nations, descends directly from Japheth, whose sons and grandsons migrated eastward, laying the foundations for these civilizations. Some even believe that certain elements of Japanese mythology might have their roots in biblical stories. For example, tales of ancestral deities descending from the heavens to shape the world. It's not hard to see parallels with biblical creation narratives and the descendants of the patriarchs. Moreover, the presence of cultural and physical traits, such as skin tone, facial features, and even linguistic traditions, can be seen as a heritage of the ancient biblical lineages. Japheth's wife, for example, has been described by some scholars as having an Asian appearance, which suggests that these connections might be deeper than we realize. So, when we look at Japan's history, we might not just be seeing the trajectory of an island nation, but the reflection of something much larger, a story intertwined with the biblical origins of humanity. This makes us rethink history in a new light, where biblical influence might have shaped cultures in ways we never imagined. And when considering this possible connection, an intriguing question arises: how much of this influence is still present in the traditions and customs that are practiced in modern Japan? And if we go back even further in time, to the moments right after the flood, we find a crucial division in human history. The Bible describes how Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were chosen to repopulate the world. Each of them gave rise to different peoples, spreading across continents and laying the foundation for the civilizations we know today. Shem, the eldest son, became the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, including the Hebrews and Arabs. Ham, on the other hand, is associated with the African nations. But Japheth is who interests us here, because it is from him that, according to the Bible, the peoples who migrated to the north and east, including Europe and eventually Asia, emerged. Imagine the desolate lands, still wet from the flood, and these families walking away, seeking new homes. The scriptures suggest that Japheth's descendants traveled vast distances, facing frozen mountains and arid deserts, until their feet touched the lands we now recognize as Asia. Japheth's blood flowed through the veins of these peoples, and the characteristics of his lineage began to shape the future of Asian nations. The ancient Asian civilizations, such as the Chinese and Japanese, may have begun with these initial migrations. And, generation after generation, the cultural and physical traits of Japheth and his descendants were incorporated into the traditions and customs of these peoples. It's fascinating to think that, according to the Bible, the entire vast continent of Asia may have its roots in a single lineage. But what makes this story even more interesting is how these lineages intertwined. The Bible doesn't just give us a vision of a single family creating nations, but also of a complex network of interactions between peoples. As the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth spread across the world, they inevitably encountered each other, exchanged knowledge, and eventually influenced one another. And so, we see that the civilizations that emerged from these 3 lineages aren't isolated but deeply connected. Noah's biblical heritage and his sons extended across the earth, creating a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions that, in some way, reflect these ancient origin stories. As Noah's descendants spread across the world, their stories began to intertwine with the realities of emerging civilizations. And this is where biblical genealogy comes into play, a timeline that not only tells the origin of peoples but also sheds light on their deep connections, often hidden beneath layers of history and culture. The Bible offers us a kind of genealogical map of humanity, where each name, each lineage, carries the destiny of a nation. When we think of peoples like the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, it's easy to forget that, according to the scriptures, they all belong to a vast and interconnected genealogical panorama that traces back to Noah and his sons. A fascinating example of this genealogical connection is the character Sim, Noah's grandson, who is mentioned as one of the ancestors of the peoples of the Far East. But Sim wasn't alone in this story. His lineage intertwined with other biblical figures, forming the foundation of many Asian civilizations. As these genealogies unfold, we discover that the Bible doesn't just describe spiritual events, but also provides a narrative of how different nations arose and spread across the globe. The stories of Noah, his sons, and their descendants are not just tales of survival and faith, but also of founding and migration, an epic narrative of how humanity, once concentrated in a small ark, spread out and flourished in every corner of the earth. For Asian peoples, this biblical genealogy offers an intriguing perspective on their origins. According to some scholars, the lineages that came from Japheth and other descendants of Noah formed the roots of the civilizations that would later become Japan, China, and Korea. These nations, with their distinct cultures, can trace their ancestry back to these biblical figures whose lives shaped the course of history. And when we look at these ancient genealogies, we begin to see how the Bible offers us more than just spiritual stories. It gives us a vision of the ancient foundations of the world we know. Japan, like other Asian nations, may find its roots in biblical figures whose journeys shaped the destiny of entire continents. Each name in the Bible, each lineage, carries a part of humanity's story, and by exploring these genealogies, we can begin to understand how ancient civilizations, like those in the East, were formed by these sacred narratives. But genealogies aren't just lines drawn on a timeline. They are also the thread that weaves together a complex tapestry connecting peoples in surprising ways. One of these intriguing connections that emerges from the scriptures is the relationship between Asian and European peoples. At first glance, it might seem unlikely. After all, Asian and European cultures developed such distinct traditions, completely different languages, and unique physical characteristics. But the Bible offers us a different perspective, a view in which the divisions that seem so clear today may actually conceal a common origin. Japheth, one of Noah's sons, is often associated with the peoples of Europe. But his descendants, according to the scriptures, didn't stop there. As his sons and grandsons spread across the world, their genetic and cultural influences reached far beyond European borders, even reaching the lands of the Far East. And it's at this point that the stories of Asian and European peoples begin to intertwine in surprising ways. Some theories suggest that Japheth's lineage not only founded the European nations, but also contributed to the formation of Asian civilizations. Ancient biblical records indicate that certain peoples who migrated eastward carried genetic traits that directly link Asians to Europeans. This might explain why, even in such distant cultures, we see shared characteristics, like certain skin tones, bone structures, and even ancient customs that seem to have common roots. Even more fascinating is the modern scientific evidence that supports this connection. Mitochondrial DNA research has revealed that some Asian groups, like certain Chinese clans, possess genetic traits that surprisingly align with European groups. These findings suggest that, despite cultural differences, the two regions of the world share a closer ancestral heritage than we once imagined. This biblical connection between Asians and Europeans challenges the common view that civilizations arose in isolation from one another. Instead, it reminds us that the history of humanity is, at its core, an interconnected narrative, where even the most distant peoples share a common origin rooted in the ancient genealogies described in the scriptures. And when we look at Japan, China, and other Asian nations from this perspective, we realize that these peoples might be the result of a unique fusion of biblical lineages, a fusion that crossed continents and shaped cultures that, at first glance, seem so different but, deep down, share the same ancient heritage. As we dive deeper into the biblical origins of peoples, we encounter characters shrouded in mystery, figures whose stories were almost forgotten, yet whose influence still echoes through the centuries. One such enigmatic character is Sem, Noah's grandson and the son of Canaan. Sem is mentioned subtly in the scriptures, but his role in humanity's history may be more significant than it first appears. According to some ancient scholars, Sem may have been one of the ancestors of the peoples of the Far East, contributing genetically to the formation of nations like China, Japan, and Mongolia. But what makes Sem so interesting is not just his genealogical connection, but also the mystery that surrounds him. Little is known about Sem beyond his position in Noah's lineage, yet it's precisely this silence in the scriptures that invites speculation. Who was this character who, according to some theologians, left a lasting mark on Eastern civilizations? How did he and his descendants shape the cultures we now consider so distant and unique? What we do know is that Sem was described as a crucial figure in the post-flood dispersal of peoples, especially in the eastern regions. The idea that he might have contributed to the formation of Asian peoples opens up a fascinating range of possibilities. What if his story, and that of his descendants, is encoded in the traditions and mythologies of these cultures? Could it be that the ancient Asian legends about divine ancestors are actually reflections of biblical figures like Sem? Some scholars point out that certain mythological figures from Chinese and Japanese culture might share similarities with biblical characters. These similarities, though subtle, suggest that biblical narratives may have merged with local traditions over time, creating myths and legends that, in a cryptic way, preserve the memory of these ancient figures. Sem, with his almost invisible presence in the scriptures, thus becomes a symbol of the biblical influence that spread beyond the borders of the Middle East, reaching distant eastern lands. His story, or the lack of detail about it, reminds us that not all great influences are easily perceived. Often, it's the hidden, forgotten figures who play the most crucial roles in shaping civilizations. And when we think of the peoples of the Far East, like the Japanese, we can imagine that, in some way, Sem's blood and heritage still flow silently in the traditions and culture they continue to preserve today. Then, as we turn our gaze to the east, we discover something even more intriguing: a name that seems to echo through the ages, a reference that connects the peoples of Asia to an ancestral figure mentioned in the scriptures. That name is Sim. The word itself seems to carry the weight of history, as if it's a constant reminder of these people's ancient origins. Interestingly, the region of China, along with other areas in East Asia, is often referred to as the Land of Sim in ancient texts. This designation, Land of Sim, seems to point directly to Noah's mysterious descendant. But what does this really mean? Why would this part of the world be associated with Sim, and what does it reveal about the biblical heritage of Asian peoples? The answer may lie in the roots of the word Sino. Today, we use the term Sino to refer to anything related to China, Sino-American, Sino-Japanese, Sino-Tibetan. But few people know that this word is also linked to Sim, the son of Canaan. This term, which denotes the peoples of China and the surrounding regions, suggests a direct ancestral connection to this ancient biblical figure. The scriptures, particularly the book of Isaiah, make an intriguing mention of this connection. In chapter 49, verse 12, the text says, "Behold, these shall come from afar, and behold, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Sim." This reference may seem puzzling at first, but when interpreted in light of biblical genealogies, we begin to see a pattern emerge. The land of Sim is, in fact, the Far East, the region where Noah's descendants settled and flourished. But this connection doesn't end there. When we look at the book of Ezekiel, specifically chapter 38, we find another mention of the house of Togarmah, a descendant of Japheth, who inhabited this same region of the world. Japheth and Sim, in different ways, contributed to the formation of Asian peoples, and their influences intertwined over the centuries, creating the complex cultural tapestry we see today in Japan, China, and beyond. So when we hear the term Sino or read about the land of Sim, we are, in fact, touching the edges of a much older and deeper story, a story that traces back to the biblical origins of humanity. And these echoes of Sim, preserved in both words and traditions, remind us that the Bible and its stories are not confined to one specific region of the world. They spread, crossing continents and oceans, shaping peoples and cultures in ways we are only beginning to understand. And so, as we follow the traces left by the scriptures, we arrive at the heart of the ancient biblical traditions that shaped the world. The names and lineages are not merely descriptions of characters, but keys to understanding the deep connections between seemingly distant peoples. And in the case of Japan, this connection becomes even more fascinating when we consider the importance of the wives of these biblical figures. Think about it. It wasn't just the men mentioned in the biblical genealogies who shaped nations. The wives, often left on the margins of these narratives, played equally crucial roles. One particularly intriguing example is the wife of Japheth. Though her name isn't widely known, her influence appears to have been profound, especially in relation to the peoples of the East. Some scholars suggest that Japheth's wife may have been a woman of Asian origin. They speculate that her lineage brought physical and cultural traits that contributed to the formation of Asian peoples, including the Japanese. The presence of this female figure at the roots of Far Eastern civilizations raises fascinating questions about how family dynamics in the biblical narrative influenced the development of great cultures. The idea that a single female figure could have introduced genetic and cultural traits into the blood of an entire civilization is powerful. Imagine this woman, whose name was lost to time, but whose influence can still be seen in the faces and traditions of Asian nations. She wasn't just a wife. She was a bridge between continents, a figure who helped shape the destiny of millions. Some even suggest that the name Asia might have roots in this story. While the official etymology of the term is debated, some ancient theologians believed that the Asian continent may have been named in honor of this biblical figure, Japheth's wife, who left such an indelible mark on the lands of the East. This connection between biblical female figures and the formation of civilizations offers a new layer of understanding of how ancient religious traditions influenced the world in ways that go far beyond what is immediately visible. It reminds us that behind the great men of the Bible were great women, women whose contributions may have shaped entire cultures, even if their names have been lost to the sands of time. And so, when we look at Japan, China, and other nations of Asia, we can begin to see these hidden threads of history, a heritage passed down not only through the men who founded these nations but also through the women whose lives and legacies still resonate in the traditions and cultures of these peoples.